the COVID time, during the pandemic time. Okay. Now the next 20-25 minutes I'll be discussing on how to recognize a critically ill child once they reach us, the OPD or the emergency department. So I'll be discussing on what are the pathways of critical illness in children, impress upon the initial impression, primary assessment, touch upon the WHO ETAT signs, and then summarizing the entire talk. Most of the points that I will be going to discuss may be very, very basic things, but they are very, very important because they are essential and very crucial for us to identify critical illness. So with this small introduction, let me go on to the topic. In the majority of critical illnesses, the final common pathway before they deteriorate is cardiorespiratory involvement. Therefore, proper assessment of the respiratory and cardiac status becomes crucial in identifying a sick child or identifying a child who needs a more meticulous monitoring or more meticulous interventions. Yeah, that is because early identification of these subtle signs and prompt initiation of the appropriate interventions. Here, each and every word is important. The identification is important. Prompt initiation is important because the time is gold. They say like golden hour or platinum hour during the first 1 hour of emergency or trauma. And the intervention needs to be appropriate for that particular child. So all these three, when they gel together, we can actually save a life. And it is also crucial for us to differentiate between who needs our attention immediately and who doesn't need immediately, because the resources have to be appropriately shared amongst them. Okay. So when we see in children, the precipitating condition that leads to a cardiorespiratory involvement can be multifactorial. It can be a simple respiratory infection, which can be a simple URI in some child, whereas progress to lower respiratory tract, pneumonia with respiratory distress failure, and ARDS in another child. So it's crucial for us to differentiate between a child who is getting better versus a child who is getting worse. So these precipitating conditions can lead on to, if they involve the respiratory tract, can lead on to respiratory distress and then progress to respiratory failure. In some situations, it can directly progress to respiratory failure without this intermediate pathway of distress. Similarly, circulatory involvement, the hemodynamic disturbances can go on to shock, which may be compensated and later hypotensive. And both these, if unrecognized or undetected, lead on to cardiorespiratory failure and ultimately cardiac arrest. A very small minority of children, about 5% or so, have a sudden cardiac event as the primary cause, an arrhythmia or so, which results in cardiac arrest. So why we need to understand this is because survival differs. As we could see, when we identify a child in a state of respiratory arrest and we are able to revive the child, the survival is quite good, about 75 to 80%. Thus, when we allow the child to progress to a cardiopulmonary arrest or cardiac arrest, the survival drops down drastically to just about 5% or even less, and again associated with the neuro disability despite survival. So it is crucial for us to identify respiratory distress or respiratory failure, because hypoxia or hypoxemia is the predominant cause of cardiac arrest in children, and it is this crucial thing that we want to identify at the earliest. So how to identify this can be done through a simple initial impression, which is the well-known pediatric assessment triangle that we are all familiar with. So this initial impression is nothing but the few seconds that the child walks into the emergency or walks into our OPD. Just as they walk in through the doors, the first few seconds we get an impression on the child's appearance, work of breathing, as well as color or circulation, helps us to determine whether the child is sick and has a life-threatening problem, or is a non-life threatening scenario where we can wait, ask for history, get a detailed history and examination, and counsel them regarding what needs to be done. So this first quick look and first few seconds that we look at the child is very crucial, and that is what we are going to discuss in detail in the next slides. So this pediatric assessment triangle consists of appearance, work of breathing, and circulation or color. In appearance, this is the mnemonic that is used to remember. It's known by Tickles. So we specifically look at the consciousness of the child and ability of the child to interact. It is important for us to analyze all these in the developmentally appropriate context. So a baby who is developmentally subnormal also, we need to understand the underlying premorbid illness and then analyze these variables. So we look at the tone of the child, how the child is interacting, consolability, look or gaze and cry of the child. And it is also important for us to keep the child as calm as possible. Possibly the mother or caregiver can carry the child, because many of these parameters tend to get affected by the presence or absence of the primary caregiver, or when they enter into a new place. And at this point of time, when the child just walks into the is carried into the ER or carried into the OP, if we find that the child is not responding properly, then it's important for us to call for help so that we have a team to manage, and then we have to go for assessing the breathing and pulse of the child. Looking at the breathing of the child in the first few seconds, we just evaluate the work of breathing. We look at the breathing pattern as well as listen to the sounds. The normal is nothing but regular breathing with no increased retractions, no work of breathing, and no abnormal sounds. This is normal that we all know. So any use of accessory muscles, any deviation from the normal, and presence of some noise during breathing means that there is something that is abnormal. Similarly, coming to circulation or color, skin color is very important because it tells us how well the child is perfused, how the circulation to the various tissues are there. And also we can have a look at if the child has some bleeding, external bleeding that is being there. So a child with a normal color with no evidence of bleeding means that the child is having no life-threatening issues and it's normal. We can wait. And any pallor, any mottling or cyanosis, bleeding points, petechia, purpura, all these point towards that the child may have a serious problem or life-threatening problem, and we need to go for quick assessment. So at the end of initial impression, all these takes just few seconds. So we need to know whether the child is responding properly. We need to know whether some immediate intervention is needed. If the answer is yes, the child is not responding properly or any intervention is needed, we need to call for help, and the pathway is slightly different. We'll not be touching upon those now. If the child is responding well and no immediate intervention is needed, then we need to have a quick look at the ABCDE. We'll again talk in detail in the later slides. If needed, the support need to be provided for ABCDE. We need to provide the appropriate support and go for again further detailed primary assessment. And if airway, breathing and perfusion are normal, we go for a detailed primary assessment. So when we talk about primary assessment and further assessing the child, this sequence of us evaluating, identifying and intervening will be coming into place. So it is very crucial for us to know what each of these mean. By evaluate we mean that we do a good primary assessment, we do a secondary assessment with the history or other examination findings, and a few simple lab investigations which are point of care investigations if needed. And once we evaluate the child based upon our assessment, we can identify two things. If the child has some problem, what type of problem it is and how severe is the problem. And once we identify the problem, we can chip in with the appropriate or necessary interventions. And it's also important for us to know that this is an ongoing and repeated sequence. So at any point of time, if the child has some problem, we have to again go back to our primary assessment, identifying the severity of illness and intervening appropriately. So that is what is important. So going to the assessment of airway, here we remember this by this mnemonic of look, listen and feel. So we actually look for the movement of chest and abdomen. We listen for the air movements, listen for the breath sounds, any abnormal sounds that are clearly audible, and we can feel for the movement of air at the level of nostrils. So at the end of this assessment, we can clearly say whether the airway is clear, means it is open, not obstructed, there is good movement, means the airway is clear and we don't have any concern with respect to the airway. If the airway needs some simple measures, now what are those simple measures? Just like positioning of the child, a child with upper respiratory infection, maybe progressing towards bronchiolitis, may have thick mucoid secretions blocking the nostrils. So simple suctioning of the nostrils is just sufficient to relieve the child of its distress. So these are all called as simple measures. A child who has just had a seizure and is in a post-ictal state may need to be put in a recovery position, maybe need to put in a lateral position or mild head tilt and chin lift. These are all simple measures. And if the airway can be maintained by these simple measures, then we say it's maintainable. But certain circumstances may be not so common, but we may be needing advanced techniques like maybe provision of placing an advanced airway like intubation or provision of some positive airway support. These are all advanced measures. And if these measures are needed, then we say that airway is not maintainable and it needs some advanced measures. So the first assessment of airway is very, very crucial, because once we miss this and go to the next thing, then we have like missed an important part of the first initial assessment, that is the assessment of airway. Now moving on to the assessment of breathing, once the airway is clear, we assess the rate of respiratory rate. Again, emphasis of counting it for full 60 seconds when the child is quiet and calm. Respiratory rate and pattern, effort, any use of accessory muscles are there or not, how is the chest wall expanding, how is the air movement, any added sounds that are audible, air entry, and of course, the pulse oximetry is now integrated into a physical examination. So what is the saturation level, either with support or without support? That is again important for us to know. Assessing these various respiratory parameters will help us to identify whether the child is having normal breathing or has a problem. If a problem, whether distress or respiratory failure. So presence of mild tachypnea, mild increase in work of breathing, mild tachycardia, a child who is anxious with a normal color may point towards that the child is having respiratory distress. Whereas if it's marked tachypnea, again, if the child has gone into respiratory fatigue and going into bradypnea or apneic breathing, then it means it's respiratory failure. Significant increase in work of breathing, or due to fatigue, the child may have inadequate efforts. Extreme tachycardia, or in the late stages of bradycardia, a child who is comatose or not responding, all these mean that the child is in advanced stages of respiratory involvement, which is nothing but respiratory failure. And again, visible cyanosis, if present, indicates that the child is in respiratory failure. It is also important not only to assess the severity of the respiratory problem, but also knowing the anatomical involvement, because then we know what is the group of conditions that we are dealing with, and then our interventions can be appropriate. So it can be an upper airway involvement where the child can have suprasternal retractions, presence of audible stridor. There can be associated history like there's a change in voice, there's a drooling sound or a gurgling sound, or it can be a lower airway involvement where again tachypnea will be there with retractions. But the major, salient finding or characteristic finding will be prolonged expiration, presence of wheeze, and cough that is very typical. So a lower airway involvement, the cough will be the predominant symptom. When the lung tissue is involved, this is very important for us to know, because the grunting will appear. So whenever there's a grunting in a child, it means that there's a lung parenchyma involvement, alveoli or lung interstitium that is involved. And it also indicates a more serious illness or an advanced respiratory failure. And again, presence of crackles and presence of hypoxemia, which is very, very early, occurs during lung tissue involvement. And disordered control, that is any trauma or any poisoning or any sedation, any seizures or any neuromuscular involvement, will result in inadequate efforts, shallow breathing, or central apnea. So it is important for us to categorize which type of respiratory involvement is there, along with the severity of respiratory involvement as well. I'll just share a few videos, 1 or 2 videos for us to just impress upon. Yeah, so this is the child where a stridor is clearly audible. You are able to see the suprasternal retractions and some amount of central sternal retractions, and we know that this is an involvement of upper airway in this child. Here we are able to clearly see the presence of subcostal retractions, which again can occur in lower airway or even lung parenchyma involvement. So this is another video where the typical salient finding that I want you to all impress upon is that the chest wall is not at all moving. So this is a child who had neuromuscular involvement. This was just prior to intubating the child, and we are clearly able to see that though the child is breathing fast to compensate for the loss in tidal volume, the child is having increased respiratory rate, but the chest expansion is actually not happening at all. It is hardly moving. And this child may in fact have a normal saturation if you put him on oxygen. So it is important for us to know that the efforts are not adequate in this particular child. Yeah, this is another last video where I just want to impress upon that this child has a deep breathing and as well as fast breathing. It's not a respiratory problem, it's actually acidosis. So not always that tachypnea or fast breathing means a respiratory problem. If the breathing is really rapid and then deeper, it can also mean that there is a metabolic condition that is underlying and the child has acidotic breathing. It's important for us to know. So few points to summarize in respiratory assessment. Respiratory failure can occur without prior distress, especially neuromuscular involvement or disordered control of breathing. Remember the third video that I showed. And again, it's very, very important for us to know that normal oxygen saturation doesn't mean that there is no respiratory failure. It's important that respiration means both oxygenation as well as ventilation. So the efforts are inadequate, the chest expansion is inadequate, we may be dealing with ventilatory failure, which is also important for us to recognize. So with this, we'll move on to assessing the circulation, which are the points that we need to look at. So we look at the heart rate and rhythm, central and peripheral pulses, capillary refill time, skin color, temperature, how are the peripheries and core temperature, what is the blood pressure. And it's also important that how is the end organ perfusion adequate or not. So we specifically concentrate on two organs, one is kidneys and brain. So urine output is an important marker which will tell us that the renal perfusion is adequate. Brain, whether the consciousness is good, will indicate that the brain perfusion is adequate or not. So these are the various parameters that we will have a quick look at when we assess these circulatory parameters, because we want to identify shock. So when we talk about shock, we have again later panel discussion. I'll just touch upon the few basic points. It basically means that there is an imbalance between supply and the demand. So the supply is not matching to the demand of the tissues. That is when we call it as shock. It could be due to volume loss. It could be due to inappropriate distributive shock as in septic shock. It could be due to primary cardiac involvement as in cardiogenic shock, or it could be due to any obstruction like a tension pneumothorax or a cardiac tamponade. Again, just like respiratory involvement, we need to know the severity, whether it's a compensated shock by which we mean that the blood pressure is normal with compensatory mechanisms, or the blood pressure is low, which means that it is a hypotensive shock. So both the type of shock and the severity of shock needs to be assessed by us. Yeah, this is just as one slide on the physiology, because we are mainly worried about oxygen delivery to the tissues. We need to know that cardiac output and the oxygen content will determine. And again, it's the preload, it's the contractility and afterload. All these three will determine the stroke volume, which along with heart rate will determine the cardiac output. And this along with the oxygen content will determine the oxygen delivery. So once everything is right and the demand of the tissue is also appropriate, then there is no shock or no circulatory impairment. It is also important for us to know what are the compensatory mechanisms. As the cardiac output comes down, the systemic vascular resistance, as you see in the first part of the slide, it increases. So what it does is it maintains the blood pressure in the within the normal range during the initial stage. But once a particular point is reached, the increase in SVR cannot compensate for the low cardiac output, and that is when our blood pressure falls, and that is when here hypotensive shock ensues. So it is important for us to know that hypotension is a late sign of shock. So these compensatory mechanisms help us to identify shock. The increased heart rate can reflect as tachycardia, which is inappropriate for the age, sex, and age and the temperature of the child if she has. The increased vascular resistance can be manifested as cold skin, pale and mottled skin, delayed capillary refill time, weak pulses, narrow pulse pressure. And due to redistribution of the blood, apart from the splanchnic circulation, you can have some ileus, can have some vomiting, can have oliguria. And when brain perfusion is also affected in certain ways, you can have some alteration in consciousness like confusion, anxiety, disorientation, the child is agitated, fighting the mask, etc. All this can indicate that the cerebral perfusion is impaired. This is a quick formula that most of us will be aware. Less than 70 plus age into 2, the systolic blood pressure, if it is less than that, that means hypotension is there. And also a fall in blood pressure. If there is a serial monitoring and the fall in blood pressure of 10 millimeter or more, again means that we are in for a significant fall. And within it takes a few hours for compensated shock to progress to hypotensive shock, whereas within few minutes, the child can land up in cardiac arrest. So it is very, very crucial that if we see a child in hypotensive shock, that means it's already pre-terminal, or it means that impending cardiac arrest is there. Yeah, I think these slides we will be again discussing with when we have the shock panel discussion. Now we'll just touch upon two important reasons for shock in children. One is volume loss due to diarrhea, dehydration, and blood loss. So when a child has mild dehydration, we can just manifest with dry mucosa and low urine output. These can be the first early signs. So presence of history of urine output is very, very important whenever we have diarrheal dehydration or vomiting dehydration in place. When the dehydration is more severe, goes to the moderate category, we can find some clinical signs like tachycardia, poor skin turgor, sunken eyes or sunken fontanelle, and oliguria can be marked. When it goes to severe dehydration, where nearly 15% of estimated weight is lost, we have marked tachycardia. Some disturbance, I think. Okay. Absent pulses, narrow pulse pressure, and in late stages can go to hypotension. So assessing these clinical signs will help us to know what is the degree or severity of dehydration. Therefore, our intervention will be appropriate.
Dr.
Again,
Balaji, we have 5 more minutes.
Yeah, I'll be winding up. Similarly, for blood loss, if it is just a mild severity where less than 30% of blood loss is there, the child can be just anxious, have some tachycardia, pulses may be just weak or ready. The blood pressure is be normal in the initial stages. When it is moderate severity, when the blood loss volume is 30 to 45%, again now the blood pressure is normal, but you start look at the pulse pressure, the difference between systolic and diastolic blood pressure, they become narrow. So once we have this narrow pulse pressure, then we mean that the blood loss is really moderate amount, nearly 30-45% of the blood loss has already happened. But when we see a child who is having bleeding and has an hypotension, that means it's like more than 45% of the blood volume is lost. So a child who is unresponsive, difficult to arouse, has absent pulses, hypotensive, means that the severity of blood loss is significant, nearly at least half of the blood volume is already lost. So knowing these signs is important for us to understand the severity of volume loss in these particular scenarios. So just to summarize on circulatory assessment, again, I want to impress upon hypotension is a late sign, indicates impending cardiac arrest. In certain scenarios of warm septic shock, which is a very special subgroup where the systemic vascular resistance is low, you can have sometimes early hypotension. But predominantly, BP is low means it is we are already missed the crucial first few hours. And recognition of altered sensorium as a sign of circulatory insufficiency is also very important, because altered sensorium doesn't always mean it's a neurological cause. Due to respiratory or circulatory involvement, again, you can have some altered sensorium. Now moving on to disability, we have finished ABC. It is again a quick evaluation of neurological function by means of ABPU scale, pupils, etc. Again, as I told, it can be primarily neurological problem or secondary neurological involvement due to a cardiorespiratory involvement. When it is sudden in onset, like cerebral hypoxia, sudden, you can have sudden syncope, sudden loss of consciousness, seizures, pupil dilatation, etc. Whereas when it is gradual, we have irritability, some lethargy, some mild changes in the sensorium that can be that can indicate that there's a gradual cerebral hypoxia that is happening. So ABPU is a short scale. It can correlate with the modified GCS. Like an alert child means a GCS of 15/15. A child who is verbal means about 13/15 GCS. Just pain responsive means it's about 8/15, and unresponsive means like it's either 6 or less than 6. So just a ABPU scale is a simple scale that can be used. It's also important for us to know the pupillary response to light as well as the other D in disability is dextrose. So point of care blood glucose monitoring is also important for us to know. And then finally the exposure, avoiding unnecessary hypothermia or exposure to cold. We need to expose the child as appropriate, look for any bruises, bleeds, any deformities, and of course take the temperature. So with this we complete the primary assessment where we have A, B, C, D, E. Look at the severity of involvement, type of involvement, either distress, respiratory failure, compensated shock, or hypotensive shock, and what type of involvement is there. So then there's some noise, I think, in background. Yeah. Again, after this primary assessment, we then move on to the secondary assessment, which is a focused history. Sample is the mnemonic, signs and symptoms, allergies, medications, any past medical history, what are the last meal the child took, and what event led to the current illness, and a focused head-to-toe physical examination and ongoing reassessment. Any intervention is needed, then again you go for primary assessment and then you reassess the child. At any point we come across these life-threatening conditions like severe RV obstruction, child has significant work of breathing, not detectable pulse, hypotension, bradycardia, suddenly becomes unresponsive, suddenly has a seizure, suddenly has a bleeding point, a petechiae purpurae, then we stop, we address that, and again we go back to the assessment. So this systematic assessment will help us that we don't miss upon important findings, and it will also help us to know assessment as a whole. So WHO has again summarized all these and given that these are the emergency signs. a child with a severe distress, obstructed breathing, central cyanosis, comatose child, somebody who's convulsions, or a child with diarrhea who is lethargic, sunken eyes, and very slow skin pinch. Any two out of these three means that the child is having some emergency life-threatening condition, so that we can address it at the earliest. These are called as priority signs put forward by WHO in their emergency triage assessment and training. A baby who is tiny, less than 3 months, that's what they define. Very high temperature, severe trauma, who looks pale, there's a history of poisoning intake, severe pain, child is in respiratory distress, is unusually irritable or restless, presence of malnutrition, major burns. All these indicate that the child has a priority sign. So these children should be triaged, maybe looked at in priority with detailed assessment, and then maybe management at that place or referral to an appropriate place. So with that, I conclude my talk. So the summary is majority of childhood critical illnesses or the critical clues can be recognized if we have a systematic approach. The first few seconds are very, very important as the child walks in or the child is brought to the emergency or brought to the OPD, the initial impression. And the assessment pentagon of A, B, C, D, E is also very, very crucial. And evaluate, identify, intervene. This cycle will always follow. So once we evaluated, we have to identify the problem and then give appropriate interventions and then again reassessment. And at any point of time, the life-threatening problems which we have mentioned. So if any of these are there, then we have to stop there, address the problem, and then move on to the next thing. So with this, I take